This Shabbat is called Shabbat HaGadol, the Great Shabbat, because it is the Shabbat that is before Pesach. There are differing customs regarding Shabbat HaGadol and the special Haftarah that is read on Shabbat HaGadol. Many communities, if not most, read the special Haftarah on Shabbat HaGadol, on the Shabbat that is before Passover, regardless of when Passover falls in respect to that Shabbat. In other words, whether Passover falls in the middle of the week, towards the beginning, towards the end, or on Shabbat, the Shabbat that is before Passover, we read the special Haftarah. Hasidic custom is to read the special Haftarah only if Shabbat HaGadol is literally the day before Passover, and Passover falls on Saturday night. So as soon as Shabbat ends, Passover begins. That is not the case this year, and therefore we will be reading the regular Haftarah for the Torah portion, which is Metzora, not any special Haftarah at all. So that's the one that we're going to be learning today. The Parsha of Metzora is, again, all about the skin disease that's, again, usually mistranslated as leprosy or psoriasis, in Hebrew called tsaras. The reason we know it is a mistranslation to label them as either psoriasis or leprosy is because both of those maladies have a physical, biological cause, and tsaras has a spiritual cause, or several causes, but all spiritual. In the same way as the Torah portion describes the purification procedure for one who had tsaras, and now that has cleared up, and the resultant purity is that much stronger of a purity than he had even before the disease, and his new-found connection to Hashem and to the Jewish people, his fellow, is even stronger than it was before the entire happened with him. In the same way, we have our Haftarah describing four people who have tsaras, called Mitzeiraim, four people who have tsaras, and through their being Mitzeiraim, through their being lepers, again for lack of a better translation, because it's not really leprosy anyway, we have in fact the defeat of the Arameans, and we have the saving of the Jewish people from starvation. An upside, of course, because they were afflicted in the first place. So we begin with chapter 7 of Kings, of 2 Kings, verse 3. Now there were four men, specifically this is Gehazi and his three sons. Gehazi was an assistant prophet Elisha, who ended up actually becoming not such a good guy, and he ended up taking advantage of Naaman, the Syrian, who had tsaras. He himself was a Mitzera, and he came to Elisha for treatment because he recognized Elisha as a man of God, and his assistant, Gehazi, and his three sons ended up taking advantage of him, stealing his clothes, and so on and so forth. And because of this, what's called midah keneged midah, measure for measure, they themselves were stricken with his disease, with tsaras. Now there were four men stricken with tsaras, I guess in English you could render it as zarath, at the entrance of the gate. They were at the entrance of the gate on the outside, because as we learned actually in last week's Torah portion, Parsha, the requirement, one of the requirements, the main requirement certainly for a Metzora, for somebody who has tsaras, is to remain by himself outside of the encampment, or in this case outside of the gate of the city, so that he will be taken out of the environment which usually causes tsaras, namely gossip. When he is by himself, he has no one to talk to and no one to talk about, and therefore that would be a perfect mechanism, a perfect catalyst for his repentance, for his teshuvah, that he should stop gossiping, and that, of course, will lead to his tsaras clearing up. These four men, again, they were all related, father and three sons, they were outside of the entrance of the gate. And they said to each other, "Why are we sitting here until we die?" This is in the context of a famine, which is happening in the land of Israel, and in this case, specifically, in the city that they were immediately outside of. So they basically say, look, as we sit here, we have nothing to eat anyway. They obviously couldn't have provisions from inside the city because the city itself didn't have anything. And so they're basically up against the wall. If we say that we will come into the city with the famine in the city, we will die there. And if we stay here, we will die. They were not allowed to go into the city anyway, because again, they're Mitzrayim, they are those who have tzaras. But there are 2 points that the commentaries make to this particular clause of this particular verse. First and foremost, they're speaking theoretically. They're saying, even if we were ready to violate the prohibition of re-entering the city while we have tzaras, again, the requirement is that they remain outside of the city, but even if they were willing to violate that requirement and violate the prohibition of re-entry, they still wouldn't have an upside because there's nothing to eat in the city anyway. And number 2, one of the commentaries points out that, of course, generally, there is the prohibition of the person with tzaras going back into the city or back into the encampment. The requirement is that he stays outside. But many, many requirements exist and many, many prohibitions exist. In fact, 610 commandments exist, that even though they are absolutely biblical requirements or prohibitions, if it is a question of life and death, and this was the question here, they were in a situation of actually starving to death, you're not supposed to die in order to fulfill the commandments, except for 3. 3 prohibitions, what are called the cardinal sins of Judaism. Yes, one does not violate those, even if it means death. But this isn't one of them. The prohibition of the person with tzaras going back into the city, or the requirement of the person of tzaras being outside of the city, is not one of the 3 cardinal prohibitions. And therefore, even if they weren't speaking theoretically, even if they were speaking absolutely practically with actual intent, because they're technically allowed, it wouldn't help because, again, there's no provisions in the city anyway. So now, let us go and let us defect to the Aramean camp. The Hebrew word here, which is not incorrectly, but very loosely, let's say, rendered as defect, is actually nipla, v'nipla el machane aram. V'nipla means like fall upon. The way that the context is, the Mitzudas David explains, the Mitzudas Tzion explains, is that if someone falls on someone else's care, they have, in essence, given their entire self to that person. So defecting to the Aramean camp means we're no longer associated with the Jewish nation, we're no longer associated with the Jewish city that is suffering famine. If they will have us and we will be able to survive there, we give our entire self to them. That's the simple kind of etymology of this expression. And therefore, defecting is perfectly legitimate as a translation in this context, certainly. But it's pointed out that Venipla literally means to fall. And so, by virtue of leaving their Jewish background and going to the Arameans, that would be a spiritual descent. Hence, that terminology is on a deeper level, the reason why it's used here. They continue to say, if they spare us, we will live, and if they kill us, we will die. In other words, there's no downside to any of these options. What's the worst that can happen? We die, we're going to die anyway. And they arose in the evening to come to the Aramean camp, and they came to the edge of the Aramean camp, and behold, no one was there, especially where there should have been someone there to guard the camp. Why was there no one there? Verse 6 tells us, now the Lord had caused the Aramean camp to hear the sound of chariots and the sound of horses, the sound of a great army. It's important to point out, obviously this is a miracle the Lord caused, but more specifically, it's that the Aramean camp alone heard these particular sounds. Not that these sounds were miraculously made to be heard in the area, and anyone in the area would have heard them, but rather specifically the Arameans were meant to hear them, and not anybody else, even if they were, let's say, right next to the Aramean camp. That is because, of course, God planned that the Aramean camp would become this source of salvation for the Jewish people that were suffering from hunger, as we'll see in a second. And they said to one another, the Arameans said to one another, behold, the king of Israel has hired for us the kings of the Hittites and the kings of the Egyptians to attack us. Now, for us is a technical translation, but here, olenu means like upon us, against us. The reason why these two nations, the Hittites and the Egyptians, are the ones that are specifically other nations in the area, the Amalekites still existed in the area, plenty of other nations that also had good militaries and could have been ostensibly hired by the Israelites, by the Jews, against the Arameans, is because the Arameans also didn't lack for a military. They also were strong and mighty and powerful, as we'll see with all the things that they left in their camp. But the two nations of the Hittites and the Egyptians were specifically those that they knew of their own accord that they would not be able to defeat. In other words, if the Hittites or the Egyptians had actually come upon them, they could genuinely suffer a defeat. For that reason, it was those two nations that they immediately suspected that were hired to come to attack them. And they picked themselves up and fled at dusk, leaving behind their tents, their horses, and their donkeys, the camp as it was, and they fled for their lives. Now these Mitzrayim, again, that's the plural term for someone who has tsaras, these 4 men with leprosy, or again, lack of a better translation, came up to the edge of the camp, entered one tent, ate and drank, and carried off from there silver, gold, and clothing. So we see that even though it's their encampment, they have so much silver, gold, and things that they actually have in their encampment, all of these valuables. And they entered a random tent, all of a sudden all this stuff was there. And they went and hid them. So they had some, there was extra left over that they took with them, left, and hid them. And they returned and entered another tent and carried off from there, and they went and hid them. So any tent that they go to, there seems to be stuff. And there's so much stuff that they can eat to their fill, though they're hungry, and still have leftovers in order to go and hide. The reason why they do this several times, according to the Talmud, it actually was done 3 times, not just 2, they were always suspecting that this camp wasn't deserted fundamentally, that, temporarily the Arameans were gone, but any time they could come back. So they couldn't really take their time and organize all of the looting or, the spoils of war. So they had a little bit and left, had a little bit and left. Verse 9. Now one said to another, this is the father speaking to his 3 sons, we are not doing right. In other words, the way we're behaving is incorrect in this case. We'll look, however, at the Hebrew, which says, "Vayoimru ish el reyehu lo chein anachnu eisim hayoim hazeh." Technically, it's translated as, not yes are we doing. Something that God, for example, would say yes to would be right. This is not yes. That's the simple implication of the language. However, the fundamental idea of serving God is to erase the no. For example, the verse tells us, Eish tamid tukad ala mizbeach, loy sichbe. There's a requirement that there be an eternal flame lit and burning in the belly, in the opening of the altar. It cannot be extinguished. That's the simple translation of the verse, the simple implication as far as the legal requirements. There's a requirement to keep it burning, a prohibition of putting it out. But on a deeper level, when we read that verse, we can translate it as a constant flame will be burning on the altar. It shall extinguish the no. The idea of saying no to something in service of God, that idea should be extinguished. When it comes to something that is available to us in serving God, we should always say, yes, we will. So here, when one says to his fellow, we are not doing right, and literally he says, Lo chen anachnu oisim, not yes are we doing, in essence, by virtue of doing what we're doing right now, we are not doing the yes of divine service, we are in fact doing the no of the opposite of divine service. This day is a day of good news. Yet we are keeping quiet. In other words, we're taking advantage for ourselves and we're hungry and we deserve it, let's say, but there's bigger implications here. If we wait until daybreak, we will incur guilt. Why is it so important that everything happen at night? Remember that when they're having the conversation about if we go back into the city or if we stay out here, go into the Aramean camp, if they kill us, whatever, and then they say, yeah, we should go to the Aramean camp, they specifically go in the evening time. The answer cannot be that, well, they don't want to be killed by the Arameans, they don't want it to be seen as an attack. First and foremost, we're talking about 4 people, not a massive army. These 4 people are Mitzrayim. They have, again, not leprosy, but tsaras. They have a skin malady. They don't look like this massive, SEAL Team 6 or whatever coming to kill the Arameans. And on top of it all, they're going to die anyway. What does it matter? That was their whole argument. Whether we stay here, whether we go back into the city, we're going to die. So it's not because of stealth that they're looking to do this in the evening. Rather, there is a spiritual root, a spiritual mirror to everything that happens in the physical. Because in the physical realm, they are stricken with this skin malady, that means in a spiritual sense, they're impure, they're in a dark place, they're in a spiritual darkness. The reason why they are in a spiritual darkness, the reason why they have tsaras, this disease, and the reason why tsaras in general is given is actually not a negative. As much as it is a punishment for negative behavior, in and of itself, it's not a negative. And the verse that tells us in our Parsha this week, Metzora, where God says, I will inflict tsaras on your houses, he's actually using there the verb, and I will give, the same exact verb as like giving a gift. So in essence, tsaras is a gift. It's a gift because it is a blatant and conspicuous occurrence that must put the person face to face with a problem. You can't ignore your misbehavior from now on. You're stricken with tsaras. You must choose to repent. And in that regard, it is a gift. It's a positive because it leads to a positive end. In the same way, their being in evening time, and again in the spiritual sense, in the spiritual darkness, is not a bad thing. It's not a punishment in and of itself. Rather, it is a positive. They have the ability to transform their dark situation into a lighter one, both on a personal level and now, as we see, on a national level as well. Therefore, they say, if we wait until daybreak, we will incur guilt. Again, practically, there's no downside to waiting until daybreak. They don't have to do this at night. But in the spiritual sense, because they are specifically in that state of spiritual darkness, i.e., nighttime, if they wait until they're personally out of that, if they're personally clear of their tsaras and purified from their tsaras, so now they are at daybreak, that will be guilt because they haven't taken the opportunity to transform that darkness into light. So they say, now let us go and come and relate this in the king's palace. And they came and they called to the gatekeepers of the city and told them, saying, we came to the Aramean camp, and behold, there is no man, there is no sound of a human, but the horses are tethered and the donkeys are tethered, and the tents are as they were. We'll notice that it says tethered or tied, but in the Hebrew, it says asur, like something that is prohibited. Asur. Mutar is permitted, asur is prohibited. The reason why those two words in the English, bound or tethered and prohibited, are rendered from the same Hebrew word asur, is because just as something is physically tied or bound or tethered and therefore can't move, can't go anywhere, if something is prohibited, it cannot be used for serving God, right? You can't eat pork in the way that you could eat, let's say, beef, kosher beef, and then use that energy to serve God. One is permitted, unbound, and so when I eat it and use that energy and serve God, that energy, that spiritual life force of that cow, for example, elevates to a higher plane because it has been used in godly service. Therefore, it can do all that, or that can happen with it because it is unbound. Here, something that's prohibited is bound. No matter how much I might eat of the pork and use its energy to serve God, that isn't going anywhere because it was a prohibition in the first place. When they say that the horses and the donkeys are tethered, that's because they were, for the Arameans, not only a mode of transportation or some kind of a utilitarian vehicle, but they were also the object of their idolatry, prohibiting them from being of benefit to God. They are now the objects of exactly the opposite of serving God, rather serving idols. For that reason, they use the term asur, they are tethered. That's also one of the reasons why it's said in the singular, right? Technically it's translated as the horse is tethered and the donkey is tethered. Of course, the implication is plural, but why it's said in the singular is because the concept, not a particular donkey or many of them, but the donkeys or the horses are fundamentally, that whole category is prohibited, and therefore it's said in the singular. And he called the gatekeepers, and they related it to the king's palace inside. In other words, there was a system of gatekeeping where there was always an outer gatekeeper who had to stand his post no matter what, but then there were replacements on the inside. So when these four guys come and tell the outer gatekeeper, he himself can't go tell the king because he has to stand his post. But he called to the other gatekeepers, and they related it to the king's palace inside. And the king arose at night and said to his servants, "Now I will tell you what the Arameans have done to us. They know that we are hungry, so they left the camp to hide in the field. And when they come out of the city, when the Jews will come out of the city to go to our camp, we will seize them alive and enter the city. In other words, we're going to lay a trap for them." That's what the king thinks that they're going to do. His servants called out and said, "Let them take now 5 of the remaining horses that are left there. Behold, they are like all the multitudes of Israel that are left there. Behold, they are like all the multitudes of Israel that have perished." In other words, we're all dead anyway, whether it's the people that are currently alive or those that have already passed away because of the famine, because of the hunger. "So let's take 5 riders and see if you're right. And let us send and we will see. If in fact that's the case, then they'll take the bait and we'll defeat them. But in case you're wrong, then we have an entire Aramean camp from which we can take resources." So they took 2 riders of horses. Well, one second. The guy just suggested 5, right? Verse 13. Now one of his servants called out and said, "Let them take now 5 of the remaining horses." All of a sudden, it's 2. The king was agreeable to the idea because fundamentally it's right. They're dead. And regardless of that, he did not want to risk or really to condemn all 5. If they were to be, in fact, laying a trap, the Arameans, and this was, in fact, kind of going into that trap. So he decided to take the minority of the suggested amount. The suggested amount was 5. The minority is 2. And the king sent them after the Aramean camp, saying, "Go and see." So here it says, "Go and see," but you could just as well say, "Come and see." And if we look at the previous verse, "Go and come," and relate this in the king's palace. So is it go or come? So unlike in English, where going is from here to somewhere else and coming is from there to here, usually in Hebrew it's the same way in addition to that as well, but there are verses that have kind of an use of the 2 terms. In other words, just because it says go doesn't necessarily mean it's from here to over there, and come doesn't necessarily mean from there to over here. In addition to that kind of logistical or practical perspective, go and see versus come and see is the difference between danger and benefit. When somebody is going, he's being sent off, that's to a danger, away from security. When someone is told to come, then that is to benefit because you're coming to something that's good. Here he says go and see because again it's a context of danger. The Arameans could be laying a trap. Verse 15, "And they followed them up to the Jordan, and behold, all the way was full of garments and vessels that the Arameans had cast off in their haste. And the messengers returned and related it to the king." In other words, it doesn't look like it's a set trap. It looks like the Arameans were actually fleeing and wanted to get away as fast as possible and not be burdened by all of their stuff. "And the people went out and plundered the Aramean camp, and a se'ah of fine flour, a particular volumetric measure, was sold for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley were sold for a shekel," which is like unbelievably clearance levels of price, "according to the word of the Lord." Earlier, God said, and this isn't part of the Haftarah, but it's certainly part of the chapter, or the previous chapter as well, where despite the hunger, the prophecy of Elisha was that God said that there was going to be this unbelievably cheap food. And we have a little bit of a recollection of this in these verses. "Now the king appointed the officer upon whose hand he leaned on the previous day over the gate, and the people trampled him, and he died, as the man of God had spoken when Elisha prophesied this, which he spoke when the king had come down to him." This was the background of this story, and it was when the man of God had spoken to the king, saying 2 seahs of barley will be sold for a shekel, and a seah of fine flour will be sold at this time tomorrow in the gate of Samaria, that the officer answered the man of God and said, "And behold, if God makes windows in the sky," in other words, let's say God can do that, but even if he were to do a miracle greater than that, will this thing come about? In other words, doubting God. And he said, "Behold, you will see it with your own eyes, yet you shall not eat therefrom." Why not? If everybody's benefiting, why can't I? Because he ends up being trampled. And so it happened to him that the people trampled him in the gate, and he died.